the planet as a whole. And it just generally causes weather patterns to be less predictable. And we are creatures of predictability. Our agriculture, our water, everything relies on predictability. So this causes chaos, basically. So the gradual changes, these are referred to as slow onset effects, processes, or events. These can be sea level rise, increasing temperatures, ocean acidification, glacial retreat, salinization, land and forest degradation, loss of biodiversity, and desertification. So historically, these effects can be difficult to isolate as drivers of movement. And this has been a lot of the contention with climate change. We can't see it, point to it, prove it, and these have been a little bit harder to recognize. But these unexpected weather patterns can make it difficult to maintain and grow crops in regions that rely on farming, for example, because expected temperature and rainfall levels can no longer be relied upon. Sudden onset climate and weather related disasters, such as storms and cyclones, these are a little bit more what people think of when you think of climate change. So Hurricane Irma, for example, Hurricane Maria, all of the hurricanes that we've been seeing, that these supermassive storms. Climate change has been connected with these damaging weather events. So more frequent, more intense hurricanes, floods, downpours, winter storms. In polar regions, the warming climates, the warming global temperature associated with climate change have meant that ice sheets and glaciers are melting at accelerated rates from season to season. So this contributes to sea level rising in different regions of the planet, and together with expanding ocean waters due to rising temperatures, because when temperature rises, the water pretty much expands, because it's just what this does. This results in sea level rise, and this begins to damage coastlines as a result of increased flooding and erosion. So climate has continually changed throughout the Earth's history. When this occurs naturally, it's usually a slow process that takes place over hundreds and thousands of years. But the human influenced climate change that is happening now is occurring at a much, much faster rate. So that being said, I just want to touch into vulnerable communities. So these can include small islands, indigenous and traditional communities, women and children, least developed countries, and this overlaps with small islands. So, for example, Irma, Maria, and Dorian, Harold, these aren't just names to us. These hurricanes in the Caribbean and the Pacific have wiped out entire annual GDPs of nations hit. And in some cases, they left islands totally uninhabitable. So McKinsey research shows, and this is a quote, that the value at stake from climate-induced hazards could conservatively increase from about 2% of global GDP to more than 4% of global GDP in 2050. And the risks associated with climate change are multiplying. They vary by locale, they evolve, and they have non-linear systemic effects that tend to be regressive. In short, a small physical shift can change entire systems irreversibly, and vulnerable populations could be affected disproportionately. So we just went through the vulnerable populations, and let's go over them again. Small islands, indigenous and traditional communities, women and children, least developed countries, which again overlaps with small islands. And it leads to climate migration, and climate migrants are some of the most vulnerable. And it also affects you. You are all business people, am I right? So as business people in a small island, your business is at increased risk. And how does climate change impact life in the Caribbean? And more particularly, how does it impact business in the Caribbean? So let's start with insurance. High risks equals more claims equals higher premiums. So the first thing to note is that as more insurance claims start to come in overall, the more cost and risk the insurance companies have. So they're inclined to increase premiums to everyone as soon as they start to notice that risk is increasing from the increase of claims. So those who submit claims will definitely see premiums increase, but an overall increase of claims will also increase insurance premiums for everyone else. So here are some, and this might sound a little bit redundant because I'm going to go over some things here and then I'm going to go over a little bits, but bear with me. So wildfires every year, well, most year, this year was quite wet. So most years, wildfires plague Trinidad. And you can see, I can see them in the Northern Range all the time. The risk of wildfires, as the risk of wildfires increases, so do the claims coming in. And again, I don't want to repeat this. The insurance premiums start to increase too. And as they notice that the risk is affecting everyone, they increase premiums to everyone. So floods, and again, another main risk with this associated with climate change is floods. And high temperatures increase the amount of water that air can hold. So therefore, global warming increases the amount of heavy rains that we see, as well as the storms and the hurricanes that can also flood cities. So every year we see in Trinidad, in certain areas, we have floods. They're just flood prone. But recently, we've been seeing the extremity of people resorting to climbing onto their roofs to escape the severity of the floods. And this is not something we've always seen historically in Trinidad. So again, with the risk of floods increasing, insurance costs will increase to adjust for this. And then construction costs are increasing too. So adding on to the rising insurance costs due to rising risks, the cost of construction is also increasing. So this has an impact on insurance costs, because if the cost to rebuild a home is increasing, then the insurance premiums will need to be adjusted to make up for the increases in construction costs associated with rebuilding a home as well. So you get an idea of how this kind of spirals out of control. And so it's strange to think of you yourself as a business community as being a vulnerable community, but you really are, being in a small island. So how does climate change affect daily life in the Caribbean? And what are the vulnerabilities of a small island developing state? I'm not going to go into indigenous communities right now or women and children. I want to hit home to us in the Caribbean, how this can affect us. And so, I'm hearing stuff outside with the kids. So again, we said more frequent and more severe hurricanes and tropical storms. And I know I touched on this before, but I'm just, going into it. So scientists have established that the increasing number of strength of the hurricanes and storms that we've been experiencing in the Caribbean is because of global warming. So for example, Jamaica is affected by a hurricane or tropical storm every 3.8 years. And previously, Jamaica was hit once every 9.4 years. And I'm sure you realize that there's increased tropical storm activity in Trinidad, which we don't often see because we're outside of the hurricane belt. So that's changing as well. That's something we need to keep an eye on. So there's an increase in the length of dry season sometimes, and a decrease in the length of the rainy season, which affects agriculture and food supply. And that's not always the case in Trinidad, but this is other islands. A shorter rainy season and a longer dry season will reduce the supply of water, including drinking water, to homes, communities, and businesses. A rise in sea level and coastal flooding and the increased likelihood of storm surges have implications for communities in built-up areas along the coast, which is quite common in the Caribbean, and for the tourism industry. Again, this is not something that we really need to look at because our tourism industry is not a huge driver, but we want to diversify. So that is something that we should keep in mind. But then also it affects industry. So rising sea levels can also pollute underground water sources through the process of salinization. Intense rains and flash floods, which do not compensate for shorter rainy seasons, these are very damaging as they wash away topsoil and increase the amount of sediment that gets into the domestic water supply. And then an increase in temperatures. So as times get hotter, our physical comfort is affected. I'm sure we're feeling that right now with this heat wave, because I don't know about you, but I am dying. As soon as I come out of any sort of climate controlled area, I'm just like, oh my gosh, it's just too hot. But beyond health, warmer seas are damaging our coral reefs. our supply of fish. Mosquito-borne diseases are also more likely to spread as warmer temperatures encourage mosquito breeding and thriving. Diseases that mosquitoes carry, like dengue fever, chikungunya, Zika, are sometimes called vector-borne diseases. Also called vector-borne diseases. These increase as well. So it's not just always the things that are most obvious. So then there comes to the environmental degradation, the destruction of our wetlands or forests or coral reefs. For example, mangrove ecosystems are not only nature's nurseries, but they also provide natural defenses to flood control, storm surge protection, groundwater replenishment, and limits the impact of sea level rise and droughts. And so when we cut down the mangroves, this is one of the consequences. So the risks of decarbonizing society is something that we don't always think of as well. Many islands in the Caribbean are frugal with energy use because they are energy poor economies. But Trinidad will have a difficulty with decarbonizing society because we're an energy rich economy due to our oil and gas reserves and our high level industrialization, manufacturing, and our local subsidy for energy use. So there's also the economic impact, the disruption to associated to supply chains, affects floods, droughts, agricultural outputs, public health, labor supplies, social stabilities, all of these things which businesses rely upon for steady and consistent performance. So for the Caribbean, the estimated annual cost of inaction could total $10 billion by 2025, $22 billion by 2050, and $46 billion by 2100, representing 5%, 10%, and 22% of the region's GDP respectively. And this is from the Caribbean Community Climate Change Center in 2012, and that was all the way in 2012. I don't know what the numbers would be for 2021. And we can see it. We can see in the Caribbean region with the increased strength of the hurricanes and Irma, Maria, and Dorian. We see it in Trinidad where long-term weather patterns have dramatically shifted. We see it in Haiti where a tropical storm hit not a week after the second devastating earthquake to devastate the country in a decade. This impeded rescue efforts where approximately 2,000 people were declared dead, and not only from the earthquake, it was from the consequences of the earthquake. So the United Nations Environmental Programme's 2020 emissions gap report highlights that despite a brief dip in carbon dioxide emissions caused by the COVID-19 pandemic, the world is still headed for a temperature rise of 3% this century. This is far beyond the Paris Agreement goals of limiting global warming to well below 2% and pursuing 1.5 degrees Celsius. And that would be an amount that's untenable for people on the planet. We would not be able to survive 3%, 3 degrees. Why do we keep on saying percent? 3 degrees. So the IPCC report stated how grave this was. The global surface temperature was 1.9 degrees higher Celsius in the decade between 2011 and 2020 than between 1850 and 1900. The past 5 years have been the hottest on record since 1850. The recent rate of sea level rise has nearly tripled compared with 1901 to 1971. Human influence is very likely 90%, and for scientists to say very likely, they mean it. So, you know, they're trying to avoid any sort of risk, but very likely is 90%. The main driver of global retreat of glaciers since the 1990s and the decrease in Arctic sea ice. It is virtually certain that hot extremes, and again, virtually certain is very strong language for scientists to use, that hot extremes, including heat waves, have become more frequent and more intense since 1950s, while cold events have become less frequent and less severe. So the new report of the IPCC makes it clear that the warming we've experienced to date has made changes to our planetary support system that are irreversible on timescales of centuries to millennia. The oceans will continue to warm and become more acidic. Mountains and polar glaciers will continue melting for decades or centuries. And under the Paris Agreement, countries have undertaken pledges to take action against climate change, but the 10-year time frame before us is our last chance to be able to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. So I'm just going to speak a tiny bit about the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. This is the body that's going to be holding the climate talks in November that we're hearing about in the news. So they were created, the UNFCCC was created over 30 years ago in 1992. The UNFCCC entered into force on 21st March 1994. Today it has a near universal membership. The 197 countries that have ratified the convention are called parties to the convention. So that means that there's now been 30 years of intergovernmental negotiation or talks as to how governments around the world can come together and address the impending climate change we see around us. However, there are shortcomings to this process, which is essentially toothless. And I didn't clarify something in the last in my last talk at the Rotary, my last talk to the Rotary Club, where I said it's not a binding convention. The Paris Agreement is binding, but how binding is it? How easy to enforce is it? It's quite difficult to force a country to do something. And if they want to withdraw, they can just withdraw. For example, the US withdrew. They just re-entered, but it's very, very easy. This is not like South Africa, where the entire international community placed sanctions on them. So, how do we cause adherence to this treaty? So even at the brink of catastrophic environmental disasters that, as we speak, are plaguing the world, and we've seen it in, we're not just seeing it in the global south, we're now seeing it in the global north, in floods in Germany, in China, with horrifying images of towns washing away and people in subway carriages with water up to their necks, and just horrifying images. We see wildfires taking over entire hundreds of miles, islands in Greece, fires ravaging the west coast of the United States. So this is a reality that's just it's not poor countries anymore. It's not small countries anymore. It's not vulnerable communities. We're seeing it all over the world. So at this brink, at this edge of the catastrophic environmental disasters that are plaguing the world right now, there's no adequate global method that has been developed that is completely adequate in addressing the crisis that we're facing. And that's very worrying. That's extremely worrying for a small island. The international framework that has been developed cannot really deal with the worsening challenge of climate change. Since 1992, greenhouse gas emissions have risen 60%. The dependence on fossil fuels, which constitutes 80% of the global energy system, has not changed or reduced. So, small islands. Let's talk a little bit about small islands and get into that. Let me just pull this up. So small islands are the canaries in the coal mine when it comes to climate change. The main difficulty is that climate change does not cause the damage that we can see immediately, as we talked about the slow onset damage, but we are seeing it of the salination of freshwater aquifer lands, the rising sea level, the loss of habitable and arable lands, the destabilization of the once regular climate patterns, and it acts as a catalyst and amplifier of droughts, floods, fires, cyclones, monsoons, hurricanes, and some low-lying islands in the Pacific are even sinking. So I know I keep on repeating this, but I want it to sink in. I want these effects to sink in. It's not just a big hurricane that we're talking about. Oh, what's happening here? Oh, sorry. Did I remove a spotlight? No? I can go back to what it was. All right. Small island states are among those where the effects of climate change on human rights are quite pronounced, says the president of the, former president of the Republic of Kiribati, Mr. Tong. So for his island, sea level rise has meant water contamination, loss of lands and crops for his nation, where people are facing a future possible statelessness. And this is what I'm talking about. In some places, islands are actually sinking. Climate change impact is a moral issue above all, he said. It remains the biggest moral challenge facing humankind. And for low-lying countries, climate change is about our survival into the future. So sorry, I'm just going to skip that bit. I think I'm taking a little bit too long here. So climate change affects many human rights, undercutting the rights to health, to food, to water. And for some small island nations, it may even affect the right to self-determination, says the UN Deputy High Commissioner for Human Rights. The brunt of these violations falls on those who have contributed the least to the problem. The poorest people in the poorest countries, the children, populations of small islands, low-lying coastal lands. For some community, climate change threatens their very survival. Sorry. So I want to posit here, climate change is a human rights issue. And so I just want to stop and investigate that term human rights a little bit. How much time do I have left, Debbie?
Caroline, you're doing good, at least 10 minutes.
Okay. So what are human rights? The Universal Declaration on Human Rights, adopted by the UN General Assembly in 1948, was the first legal document to set out the fundamental human rights to be universally protected. The UDHR, which turned 70 in 2018, continues to be the foundation of all international human rights law. So 30 articles of this document provides principles and building blocks of current and future human rights conventions, treaties, and other legal instruments. And then there are two other covenants, the International Covenant for Civil and Political Rights and the International Covenant for Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. And these make up the International Bill of Rights. So there is an important principle of international human rights law called the universality of human rights. In fact, this is very fundamental to international human rights law. It means that we are all equally entitled to our human rights. This principle, as first emphasized in the UDHR, is repeated in many international human rights conventions, declarations, and resolutions. So that means that human rights are inalienable. They should not be taken away except in specific situations and according to due process. For example, the right to liberty may be restricted if a person is found guilty of a crime by a court of law. All states have ratified at least one of the 9 core human treaties, as well as one of the 9 optional protocols. 80% of states, and when I say states, I mean states around the world, countries, have ratified 4 or more. This means that states have obligations and duties under international law to respect, protect, and fulfill human rights. The obligation to respect means that the states must refrain from interfering with or curtailing the enjoyment of human rights. Let's take that off. The obligation to protect means that the states it requires the states to protect individuals and groups against human rights abuses. And the obligation to fulfill means that states must take positive action to facilitate the enjoyment of basic human rights. Meanwhile, as individuals, while we are entitled to human rights, that doesn't make any sense. Sorry, I'm just going to skip that part. But we also should stand up and respect the human rights of others. So now let's go on to human rights in the environment. You must be like, why is she going on about human rights? This is climate change. How does this affect human rights? Human rights in the environment. All humans depend on the environment in which we live. So a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment is integral to the full enjoyment of a wide range of human rights, including the rights to life, health, food, water, and sanitation. Without a healthy environment, we're unable to fill our aspirations. Without a healthy environment, we may not even have access to the minimum standards of human dignity. So protecting human rights protects the environment. In recent years, the recognition of the links between human rights and environment has greatly increased. The number and the scope of international and domestic laws, judicial decisions, academic studies on the relationship between human rights and the environment are growing rapidly. Every year, it expands. So the Human Rights and Environmental Mandate created in March 2012 and extended in 2018 examines the human rights obligations as they relate to a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. It also promotes best practices relating to the use of human rights in environmental policy making. So many states now actually incorporate. Okay, I'm going to not look at the questions, they're popping up. Many states now incorporate a right to a healthy environment in their constitutions. Yet, many questions about the relationships of human rights and environments remain unanswered and require further examination. So recently, in the UN Human Rights Council, a joint statement that was delivered by Bangladesh on behalf of 55 states, calling the council to create a special rapporteur on human rights and climate change. So they believe this new mandate would be essential to supporting a human rights-based approach to climate change, engaging in country visits, normative work and capacity building, and further addressing the human rights impact of climate responses in order to support the most vulnerable. And they asserted that this mandate should be established without further delay. So UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, warned that climate change and pollution pose grave threats to human rights and humanity itself. The UN Human Rights Chief says that human inaction in the face of planetary disasters is having a severe impact on a broad range of rights, including the right to adequate food, water, education, health, and even life itself. Extreme and murderous events, she described, have been unleashed on people in every region in recent months. And this is a quote: monumental fires in Siberia and California, huge sudden floods in China, Germany, and Turkey, Arctic heat waves leading to unprecedented methane emissions, persistence of interminable drought from Morocco to Senegal to Siberia, potentially forcing millions of people into hunger, misery, and displacement. So she warns that intensifying environmental threats constitute the single greatest challenge to human rights. And that's quite a powerful statement for her to make. She says, environmental disasters amplify tensions, conflicts, increase vulnerabilities, and exacerbate structural inequalities around the world. So for example, in Africa and the Sahel, there's a humanitarian emergency that is being fueled by climate change. Long droughts followed by flash floods, unequal access to natural resources, high rates of youth employment are plaguing the region. And I'm going through her speech because she pulls it out so beautifully. And I'm giving you these quotes because this is what we have to look at. It's not just like, oh, climate change is happening. It's how is climate change happening? How is it impacting us? How is it impacting the vulnerable? And we have to realize that we are vulnerable in Trinidad. So these trends compel people into displacement. They aggravate conflicts and political instability, and they fuel recruitment by violent extremist groups. So there's no purely military solution to the conflicts in the region. To date, 4 million people across the Sahel have been displaced, according to UNHCR estimates. And this is occurring in different forms and different versions across the world. So Asia, Middle East, North Africa, all have water shortages, causing tensions to rise over this scarce resource. And water is going to increasingly become an issue to fight about. Right now, we're fighting about oil. We're going to be starting to fight about water very soon. So you can see that in Guatemala, in Salvador, and Honduras, closer to home, it's having an impact on poverty, displacement, and affecting human rights. And so when you saw that cartel of migrants moving up to the US, that was what was behind that displacement. So climate change is impacting more than you realize. And then on a different level, in Latin America, Southeast Asia, and other regions, environmental human rights defenders are being threatened, harassed, and even killed. So, where am I going with this? This brings up an issue of climate litigation. So more and more governments are progressively committing to net zero emission goals by around mid-century, and businesses are accelerating efforts to transition and align their operations with the goals of Paris Agreement. Children and youth, Greta Thunberg, are demanding a safe climate and forcing positive change. And climate change is at the forefront of the global environmental human rights movement. And now we're also seeing, as I mentioned, climate litigation. Judiciaries around the world are increasingly playing a critical role in addressing climate change. So environmental rights, these rights are supposedly established in the public trust doctrine, as well as in with the realms of constitutional and human rights, including the right to life, right to quality environment. Parties have sought to invoke these environmental rights in litigation. So this growing body of case law is contributing to an expansion in the content of fundamental rights in the climate change context. So why is climate litigation becoming more popular? Will it be more popular in the global south? Who will it target? In 2017, 884 climate change. Oh, wait, Debbie, how long do I have again?
Caroline, I would say 5 minutes because we do want to have a few questions as well.
Okay. So I'm not going to go into the actual cases. I'm just going to talk around the cases because the actual cases are quite interesting, but yeah, I'm not going to subject you guys to that. So
no, but I don't want to limit you. I mean, if it's interesting, maybe one.
Okay, I think making me decide on the cases, man. I'll see which ones we can go to. Okay, here's an interesting one. No, but if I talk about that, I have to talk about the other case. You know what? It's fine. So in 2017, I'll just talk about the cases and about the trend of the litigation. 884 climate change cases were brought in 24 countries. By the end of 2020, that number had nearly doubled, with at least 1,550 cases filed in 38 countries, 39 including the European Union's court system. So most of them were in the global north, but they were also in the global south. And while climate litigation continues to be concentrated in high-income areas, the report lists recent cases from Colombia, India, Pakistan, Peru, the Philippines, and South Africa, in projecting the trend to grow, and the trend is projected to grow further in the global south. So the background of the plaintiffs is becoming increasingly diverse, includes non-governmental organizations, political parties, as well as senior citizens, migrants, and indigenous people. So judges and courts have an essential role to play in addressing the climate crisis. Climate litigation is a key lever for keeping governments and corporations on task in the fight to combat climate change. And this was from the executive director of the Sabin Center for Climate Change at Columbia Law School, Michael Berger. He said, courts can equalize the power imbalances in society and give force to the rule of law. The adoption of the Paris Agreement in 2015 had created the opportunity to use legal instruments for climate action to reach the strategic objective of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees. The Paris Agreement created obligations for states, with subsidiary obligations for different actors. Citizens and organizations are progressively ascertaining the empowerment and prerogatives that it enables. So among others, the Paris Agreement identifies loss and damages, Article 8, climate education, public awareness, public participation, and public access to information, Article 12, enhanced transparency network framework, Article 13, and an implementation and compliance mechanism, Article 15. Against this backdrop, a typology of lawsuits have started to emerge, including actions against governments and corporations to hold them accountable for actions or inactions which aggravate climate change. And let's see if I can, I'm just gonna jump to the end here. Transitional justice. So the UN defines transitional justice as a full range of processes and mechanisms associated with the society's attempt to come to terms with the legacy of large-scale past abuses in order to ensure accountability, serve justice, and achieve reconciliation. And this was from 2010, the Secretary General's guidance notes in the United Nations approach to transitional justice. So transitional justice is the idea that historically rooted events, systems, and norms responsible for imposing harm must be included in any viable pathway towards a future in which all people are able to live full and flourishing lives. In this tradition, voices and experience of those who have been harmed are essential, even though politically speaking, they may be peripheral to powers of censor. But these peripheral voices are necessary. And that when I say peripheral voices, I think it's quite clear from the repetition earlier, I mean our peripheral voices, not only due to the obligations of morality, but because it is precisely the experiences of those who have been harmed and previously excluded that must guide efforts to build a more just, peaceful, and ultimately legitimate new regime based on trust and solidarity. And so I think I'm going to end there. I have a lot more to go, but yeah, that's that. I'm going to end there. Mm-hmm.
Caroline, so what that means is we may call you back for a second session.
Oh God. You really want to hear about all of these cases?
I think actually I'm going to start with my question. I was going to ask you if we have any popular local case on climate change that you might want to just share quickly on, because we have quite a lot of young persons in the audience with us, and that may be of interest.
I don't have any local cases that I have studied. There was an interesting one on Shell and Ecuador, but I have now thrown all my notes on the floor. So I'm not going to I'm not going to scrabble down and look for that right now. But I can read you a Dutch case. Sorry about that.
Let's hear it. Let's hear it.
Okay. So it's a landmark case, the state of Netherlands and Urgenda. A lawsuit was brought by a Dutch environmental group and 900 Dutch citizens in order to require the Dutch government to do more to prevent climate change. Oh dear. Hi. That was recorded, wasn't it? The Dutch Supreme Court ruled in 2019 that the Netherlands must reduce its greenhouse gas emissions by at least 25% by the end of 2020 compared to 1990. This is huge. This is so huge. You don't understand. And this is just huge. This is just unprecedented. The judgment called on the European Convention of Human Rights, Article 2, the right to life, and Article 8, the right to respect for private and family life, to justify the positive obligation of the state to take measures that reduce real and immediate risks that could jeopardize the welfare of Dutch residents, even if such impacts would only materialize a few decades from now. So yes, to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by at least 25% below 1990 levels by the end of 2020. So that was quite powerful.
I think that's a great example. So I'm going to go, we have one or two questions in the chat. I'll start with the first one from Adesh. Are there any laws against a person or company contributing to climate change, and are they enforced?
In Trinidad? No.
Adesh, we're talking locally.
Well, yes, we can start off locally first and within the region, at least Caribbean.
I can't actually I can't answer that. I'm so sorry. I haven't done that research. I can get back to you on that one though, if you want.
That's cool.
Oh, no.
Okay, and then we have a question from Namdeo. How do you...
Hold on, I see they quantify adjustments by countries. I am not an insurance expert. I just brought that up for the businesses, for the business community, but I'm a lawyer. I'm an international lawyer. I'm definitely not an insurance expert, so I cannot answer how you quantify adjustments for anything. Yes, go ahead. Let me see
and then
what some of these are.
Actually,
we have a
the qualification has to do really with reducing contributions to climate change. For example, emissions, CO2 emissions primarily. So to me, I mean, I did some research on this for something else that I was doing. And one of the issues in, for example, the conventions for climate change is how do you allocate reductions to various countries? Because the major contributions to climate change has been through industrialization via of say the US, Europe, and to a large extent China, because they burn a lot of coal for their power plants and so on. So the problem that I think they have in some of these conventions is that the developing countries are saying, well, you have developed and damaged the environment, and now you do not want us to develop for the betterment of our citizens. So that is one of the issues that they have to grapple with, because I think a lot of the things that a lot of the caps on environmental and CO2 emissions, a lot of those caps have to be agreed at the convention, and then you put in certain things. For example, Trinidad has an agreement of 10% of electrical power generation must be due to renewable energy by a certain date. I don't think we're going to make the date. And to that end, I believe a contract was awarded to a consortium of between Shell and BP, I believe, to put down a power plant. So that is where a lot of the action will be through that, through electric vehicles and so on, which is a big thing now in, say, Europe and so on. So some of the big vehicle makers, for example, like Volvo, will not be producing internal combustion engines by, I think, 2025. So that is some of the areas in which different countries are moving.
Thanks for that, Namdev. And I saw you also made a comment on the move to renewable energy as a major move to that. Unfortunately, as a country, we are still allowing the major oil companies to provide our electrical power through renewable energy rather than doing it ourselves. And I think that's a really incisive comment there. Caroline, we do have a question from Liz. How can we make small island developing states more climate resilient? And what will all this mean post-COVID?
I think becoming energy independent for small islands is very important. I'm going to jump on that point, especially in the Caribbean, where islands are quite energy poor. It's interesting that Trinidad has this resistance to developing that capacity, because we're seeing how the reliance on oil and gas is hampering us. In the future, I think that we need to make a greater effort at not only but I actually think that we should be manufacturing while we have the energy. We should be manufacturing those solar panels and exporting them, but that's my personal opinion. Technology, I think post-COVID is something we need to really invest in. Diversification of economy is quite difficult, because what do you do as a small island beyond go into tourism? Tourism is something that's going to be heavily hit by climate change. So I think we need to be quite creative with with that. So what kinds of tourism can we go into? Can we go into environmental tourism in Trinidad? But then again, we get into the point of, we are destroying our rainforests. Then also there's the impact on coral reefs. So, it's difficult. Trinidad is are we speaking specifically in Trinidad? I'm just looking at my notes here. Hold on one second. Are we speaking specifically about Trinidad?
No,
Caroline, I think it's used.
just speaking generally.
Okay.
This Liz here.
Mm-hmm.
I was thinking about,
I think, sorry, go ahead.
making resilient in terms of infrastructure, but I know with
Yes, I was
COVID
going
and
to
all
say
the
coastal
money,
cities and
yeah.
and coastal infrastructure is something
Right,
that we
right,
really
because what I
need
was
to
thinking-
focus on.
right, with COVID and all the monies that it being shifted into COVID, it's like, listening to you is like, I want to go under a rock, really?
Oh God, I'm sorry. No, I don't mean to. I do tend to bring in that whole shock factor because I find that we're so complacent.
It's good to know. It's good to know. It's good to know.
Yeah, but actually, that was the next point that I was going to bring up with the resilience of maritime air transport infrastructure. That's kind of crucial to support sustainable trades, tourism, development. I think focusing on the vulnerability of our coastal cities and our coastal infrastructure is key, because we're seeing how, say, in New York, where you wouldn't think a city like New York is so vulnerable, but you can see the storm surges, you can see the flooding, you can see it's terrifying. So let's see, transport infrastructure, we have to improve our infrastructure for one, because we are just hampered with traffic right now. But we also have to make it climate resilient. So again, every time I try to think of something, I backpedal. I should have really prepared something like that. But what else? I think a really big thing for us to do is stop cutting down the mangroves, first and foremost. It sounds quite simple, but we really, really need to stop cutting down our mangroves, because they are a buffer. They are an incredible buffer between the land and the sea. Coral reefs as well. I noticed that when we don't really value coral reefs in Trinidad. So I think it was there was sewage kind of pumping out into a very popular coral reef, which actually contributed to its devastation. But coral reefs also are not just only an attraction, a tourist attraction for environmental tourism, but they're a buffer as well, because they reduce the impacts of the waves, of the wave action upon the shore. And then also they are nurseries, and so that will be they're nursery for fish, so that will be investing in the sustainability of the fish stocks in our waters as well. Let me think. I think health is another thing that we need to look at in terms of resilience, because we are in the tropics here with mosquito vector-borne diseases. I think that's a big one. When we saw that the whole country was down with chikungunya, things like that, it doesn't seem like a big deal, but when we see the effects of plagues right now, pandemics right now, these are things that we always had dengue. Yellow fever was kind of lurking in the back, and then chikungunya came, and everybody was just ravaged by that. Zika came, and babies were endangered. So things like that. Let's see, what else? I really think energy independence is something that you just have to stress. Energy independence is another big one. So renewable resources and renewable energy. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Guyana was talking about renewable energy and creating this green state, and then we discovered oil.
Oh gosh.
A point someone asked earlier if we had any laws for people who damage the environment, or for that matter, people who whatever who make climate change easier. The point is there were any laws in Trinidad, but there are none. And it's simple to see with how they cut down the hills and put houses, and there's just no laws, and they have never charged anybody, and they don't even think about charging anybody. You know, and as you said, the mangrove also, you just made the point about the mangrove. And so in Trinidad is like the Wild West. And I think what we feel in Trinidad is that we are so small that we don't make a big impact on the whole climate change of the world. And I think that is one of our problems.
That is a big problem. I mean, and I like to emphasize, and I know that you don't want me to say this, but nothing that we do in our country can increase or decrease the level of emissions because we're so tiny. Nothing, we are just a drop in the emissions. But that doesn't mean to say that we can't take care of our own, because whatever we do impacts us, you know? So I think you're right. I think that these are actionable offenses, but we don't recognize that at all.
But it would be a form of awareness if we decide to bring in all these laws and do decide to, you know, work on change effect. It would be and I think that is what is important.
It definitely would. We became party to the Paris Agreement in 2018, and we submitted NDCs to create a commitment to reduce cumulative greenhouse gas emissions by 15% from industrial power generation in the transport sector by 2013. But you're not really seeing that anything taking place, you know, by the actions of the state to, and I don't want to get into all of that here, because for me, honestly, I'm an international lawyer when it comes to climate change, and my focus has been more the advising small island developing states and least developed countries at the negotiations and the legal impacts and the legal jargon, explaining it and all that kind of stuff. So I hesitate to say anything definitively about Trinidad until I've done my research. I just want to make that very clear, because, you know, I'm a lawyer. I don't want to say anything that's wrong.
But
although
you say we can't impact on the world or make any big difference in the world, but we would make a difference in Trinidad. And I think that's what we have to look at, because the same climate affect what we do in Trinidad affects us, including as I said, damaging the environment and doing all these different things. On the whole, it wouldn't really affect the carbon emissions on the entire world, but we have been destroying our little island here by not following little rules.
Just all of those little planning rules that are constantly, daily ignored in construction, slashing, burning, cutting into the hills, making way for farming. We also just need to update our laws significantly to address environmental degradation. I think that's quite important.
And enforce.
And enforce. That's another one. And enforce. Because that's always a problem. Yes.
Don't worry, we have some smart lawyers that will prevent us from enforcing. But just one thing, I don't know if this came up, but one of the key things would be food security, because climate change,
absolutely.
Some of the projections forecast, less productive farmlands, etc., because of the same thing, floods and too high temperatures, etc. So that food security is a key issue And it's something that I think is probably one of the highest things on the agenda to make us resilient, as you all have been discussing.
Absolutely. That is a great point. Thank you very much. I can't believe I forgot that. Food security is highly important. Yes.
Okay, so unless we have any further questions, I would like to move into a vote of thanks. Okay, so that's going once, going twice, gone. Caroline, I really want to thank you for taking the time out to share all the knowledge that you have done with us tonight on what we in Rotary consider to be a very important topic. I know you are not a Rotarian, but Rotary traditionally, we had 6 areas of focus. And last year, we included a 7th area of focus, which was the environment. And that came about as a result of recognizing how important it is to really have this conversation and to take steps in relation to that. I quite enjoyed your presentation. I love how you linked everything, you know, how you showed us how it impacted us as business people. You touched on the litigation. You gave us, you took us through the journey, you know, so that you actually understood what climate change is, where we are as small island developing states, and the measures that we can take, you know, in terms of moving forward. One of the things that comes out so clearly, you know, when we discuss the lack of laws and enforcement is the importance of having sessions like this. This is where we as nonprofit organizations, you know, we get the opportunity to partner with people like you, to have you join us, to show us, you know, how we can take steps to put in place measures to where there's a gap, you know, where there's nobody taking action in relation to climate change. So I really enjoyed your presentation. I know I saw at one point in time we had 64 persons on the call, and that is testimony to the sort of interest that there is in this particular topic. So I just want to say, keep up the good work. Heartfelt thanks from the Rotary Club of San Fernando South and everyone who has joined this meeting tonight. And I now hand over back to our President, Chun. Chun, over to you.
Thank you very much, Debbie. Also, I'd like to say thank you very much. But before we close, I would like to ask, we have District Environmental Chair present with us, and it's a pleasure having him here. I would like to ask him to at least bring greetings from the district. So Matt, can you at least, can we see you here, bring greetings from the district and say a few words?
Sure, hi. Thank you very much on behalf of the district for the invitation. It was really great to be with you all this evening. I'm sorry I joined a little late. My regular club meeting ran on a little bit. But yeah, it was a really interesting presentation. I definitely like to learn more, and perhaps we can further that discussion at the district level at some point. We are planning some district-wide environmental sessions, so it really would be good to talk about the legislative side of it. So thank you again for the district, and sorry for the invitation, and greetings to all present on behalf of the district.
Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure having you here with us this evening. I would like to say special thanks to our guest speaker, Caroline Mair-Toby, and everyone here present. I mean, it's a fantastic evening. I'm sure we'll have to plan another one. So Debbie, call on us. We will be present. And so with that, I would like to say good evening. But before we go again, I'd like to ask members of the Rotary Club of San Fernando South to just stay back for a couple minutes. We have a couple updates. And with that, good evening. Thank you very much. Everyone, take care.
Thank you again. Good night.
Thank you. All right.
Thank
Thank you for
again.
having us. All right.
Thanks for having me. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye, Caroline.
Okay, I'd just like to thank our YouTube viewers. Thank you very much for joining us here this evening. Bye for now, and we're going to end the live stream.
Thank
Have
you,
a good
Deb.
night.